All right, Sonny, it's good to see you again. Appreciate the opportunity to do this recording with each other once again. I got some feedback from some of my colleagues and others that have been interested in the aquaculture industry. I think they did get some good tidbits from our discussion last time, so I appreciate the opportunity to do it again. So if you could, for those that didn't catch up with us last time, maybe give a brief introduction about yourself, and I'll do the same, and then we'll dive into kind of pick up where we left off last time.
Yes. Thank you for mentioning the last time, because I mean it's good that some people have good benefit from that, and I also received some messages on LinkedIn, and people were saying that this was quite interesting and helpful thing, and I think this is the way we want to kind of educate people as many as possible. So yeah, a little bit about me. Of course, I'm working with aquaculture and fish feed, land-based fish farming, alternate feed protein. So I work with the whole value chain of aquaculture. So you can call me aquaculture expert or whatever you want to call me. It's up to you. So and my name is Sunny. Last time I didn't mention that. It's good to mention this time. So yeah, so let's kick this thing off. Let's discuss.
Yeah, and so I'm Brian Grachowski. I work for Aquanics. I've got about 20 years experience in food and beverage. On the aquaculture side, we've worked for the past 5, 6, 7 years, mostly on the disinfection piece of the aquaculture process. But as we talked about last time, every piece of this feeds into the disinfection portion. So every element has got to be dialed in just right, or we can cause some problems throughout the process, obviously. So, and we'll get into some of those pieces as we go. So one thing in particular I wanted to start with, because while we covered a lot of things last time, and I just kind of got to rethinking about some of the points that we did get into or didn't get into enough. Those of us that focus more on the back end of the process for disinfection and filtration, cleaning up the water, often don't think enough about the front end of the process on the fish feed side, and really don't understand that process real well. So, I'll start with a dumb question for those in feed. This will, of course, be probably not that intelligent of a question, but it'll help those of us on the back end that don't focus on this piece. But could you talk a little bit more about fish feed, fish selection, feed selection per fish? Do you always select the same feed type based on the species, or is it operation dependent? Could you maybe expand on that a little bit? Give us a little bit of insight so we understand at least some tidbits of that process a little bit more, and then we'll evolve from there.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, so this is, of course, species dependent. So it's not like operation dependent. Operation comes later, the species comes first. So some species, they, of course, first of all, it's the nutritional content in the feed. So some fish need high protein level, some low protein level, some go well with the high fat level, some with the low fat level, and also the energy content in the feed. So I just give you the example. For example, tilapia is one of the example. For example, so tilapia go very well with the starch or the carbohydrates. On the other hand, salmon is like us. It will get diabetes and heart attack. So it's a big difference when it comes to the nutritional aspect between the freshwater and the seawater species, cold water and warm water species. So there are differences. So and then you talk about, for example, the operation dependent, right? So first you have to have a different kind of feed. I mean, they have their own nutritional requirements. You have to follow that. But this is more interesting now with the RAS thing taking shape. It has become a factor, the operations. For example, some of the companies which I have seen in Norway, for example, or global companies in the fish feed. So they have come up with new product lines which are specific for RAS or land-based fish farming. So they have taken into account some of the factors, but of course it's a constant process. So nothing could be done overnight. To try to keep things like, I want to explain things in an easy language. So I would say that some of the factors, you can say that when you put the feed in the water, the stability of the pellet, for example, that's very important. The particles, the leftover particles is called like, maybe you understand this language, or is suspended solids, which are in the water, and they are also one of the issue because you can't really collect them. You can also not really kind of sieve them or filter them if they don't really go through the filter. So they have to flow, right? So when there are too small suspended solids, there are lots of them. So I mean, while discussing with you about this disinfectant thing, I just suddenly thinking loud that I start to think loud that what will happen if these with these suspended solids, with this type of kind of disinfection approach or things like that. I mean, these are quite new. This is also a new area. So of course, there are so much things which could be new factors, but some of the main factors, for example, I can elaborate a little bit on this, some of the information which is maybe journal information is like, you have to have the solid, not just the good pellet of the feed, but that pellet of the feed has to take care of the feces of the fish, right? So fish also, I mean, as I can say as a joke, fish poo and pee in the water. So that the feces part or the poo part of the fish, so that has to be solid, because if it's deteriorating, for example, so this will also disintegrate. There will be the leftover phosphorus, for example, coming out, lots of nitrogen. So this will eventually affect the overall water quality. So this is really, I mean, it's a big area.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's a good point about the suspended solids. As you mentioned, depending on the size of the particles and the amount of the suspended solids, the filtration may or may not be enough to handle it, you know? So you think even of that piece, like a drum filter, I think is typically maybe 40 micron nominal filtration, I believe. Or maybe some facilities have ultrafiltration, you know. But even then, you know, depending on the disinfectant that's going to be used downstream, that may or may not be enough. I mean, you know, I know the drum filters are typically pretty common. You know, if a lot of the suspended solids are smaller microns and smaller particles, even if there's not a lot of them, they're going to pass straight through the drum filter. And then whether you're using something like ozone or UV or chlorine or whatever else it is, those oxidizers and those disinfectants are going to have lower efficacy levels because of the particulates in the water, you know. And it may very well make one disinfectant technology ineffective or useless in that application, depending on, again, amount and size of particles and what that filtration is. So, I mean, it is a pretty important balance. So, you know, out of curiosity from my own aspect, you know, you mentioned that even within a particular species and a specific, you know, type of nutritional value in the feed, that some manufacturers do have some RAS specific feeds, perhaps, or different operation specific feeds. You know, I know not to get into too specific, but what are those differences? What are the things that you might take into account for one operation or another, even if the nutritional value of the feed is very similar because of the species? I'm just curious.
Yeah, to keep things simple, I would say some of the factors, they are, of course, the stability of the pellet, the speed, the sinking velocity. It's, I mean, there is a word like that. So this sinking also the factor, and as I said earlier, also the how much that particles will be kind of disintegrated from that pellet. And this is one of the factor, and also of course the stability of the feces, as I said earlier, the poo of the fish, that is also you have to take into account. And related to RAS, I think I don't know if somebody has done something related to that, but just while talking with you, I'm thinking about the size of the pellet. Could be even more critical. When it comes to to think about the parameters of the water quality.
You know, we talked last time too from a feed aspect that I think the tendency still, especially for smaller aquaculture facilities, is that the feeding is typically still more of a manual process. And the amount of feeding tends to be more less data driven and more schedule driven, if that makes sense. As far as the amounts to feed and trying to gauge, you know, if you're slightly underfeeding or overfeeding, it tends to be very operator specific or operator dependent. I was wondering if you could maybe expand a little bit more on how can you optimize that? You know, what are a few small things maybe that operators could do to better dial that aspect in? And the reason I ask is because, again, not to focus too much on that piece, but you have such an important downstream effect on that feeding portion of the process. And of course, again, I'm thinking primarily about the overfeeding, where I'm sure, you know, the owners of the facility are probably more concerned about underfeeding, you know, wanting to get them to full maturity as quickly and healthy as possible. But on the overfeeding, you can really create some havoc in an operation. So how do you, any ideas on how you can kind of dial that in when it often tends to be more of a manual process?
Yeah, so this is, you're asking two things. First, you're asking about the manual and automated, and also you're talking about the overfeeding and underfeeding, yeah? So the thing is, when it comes to the automated and manual processes, of course, smaller facilities, they have more manual regime of feeding. Because they don't have the automatic feeders, for example. But even you do feeding with automatic feeding, there are some issues. For example, if fish is fish has been fed according to the theoretical understanding that this should be this amount of feed should be offered at this time of the day, and this should be this time of the day, but still there are differences on day-to-day basis based on the lack of uniformity in your fish biomass which you have. So it really varies. So a person may be doing the right thing by doing it automated way, and then still ending up bad water quality because of this overfeeding, even without doing it consciously, for example. So the reason is the biological difference between the fish, lack of uniformity in some of the cases, and now you have to see, for example, you are doing some feeding rate, or you're offering some the amount of feed based on specific biomass or the weight of the fish within your facilities. But what happens is, in many cases, this might be not the right situation because there could be different biomass inside the tanks. And you are thinking that you are feeding based on that particular biomass which are present inside the tanks or whichever facilities. And you end up feeding more also because of that. So, now the new technologies which are coming in this area, for example, so some are technologies which are coming, like they would use some sensors to have the real-time biomass detection, so that they can feed the data to the system that, okay, this amount of feed should be released. So, there are some improvements related to that. But of course, this thing is still a new thing. It should have been earlier, but this is still a new thing. And the second part of the discussion is the underfeeding and overfeeding. So of course, people tend to overfeed. And I also normally say the moment you overfeed, you destroy the water quality significantly, because this is something you're killing your own RAS, or it's more specific to that, because unfortunately the effects in the closed containment system is more compared to, for example, pond or sea cage. So this really destroys overfeeding, and I would say underfeeding should be the way to go to be sure that you are not feeding too much and you are not destroying the water quality.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I saw recently on one of the virtual RAS conference that they had, I believe last month, one of the presentations did talk a little bit about some of the newer online sensors that are available for this type of technology, as well as other water quality parameters and water quality sensors. And I think one of the takeaways from that presentation was, while it's good that we're starting to see some technologies evolve that can be utilized in these operations, they often tend to focus on one thing or one parameter. And so facilities have to decide from a capital standpoint, what should we invest in, if any, because there's not a lot of multi-parameter or multifunctional devices on the market. But it sounds to me like something like this biomass sensor makes a lot of sense to dial in that feeding piece instead of focusing maybe on, I don't know, a water quality parameter, which would be a secondary indicator of feed, for example. So just out of curiosity, have you looked closely at any of these biomass sensors? I'm just curious how well they may have worked for you or other customers that you've worked with in the past.
Yeah, this is quite, it's not extremely new technology. For example, I've been watching this in the trade shows. So they have this big biomass detectors with some used to have this sonar system to detect it in the sea cage, for example. So and of course now there are new ones coming for the land-based fish farming facilities, and some are even trying in the ponds. So they definitely have their advantage. And also you said about the water quality sensors, right? Yeah. Water quality sensors. Right. So of course they are the integral part of the whole how to do things in the right way. So more, of course, data you have, more detection you have early on, so more you are in a good shape when it comes to the overall production, of course.
So I'm gonna put you on the spot and see if you can give me a number on this one. All right. So thinking again about this balance of underfeeding and overfeeding, and that there is some variance in that site to site, maybe operator to operator. And I realize if you don't have these additional sensors involved for extra data, you're having to just kind of gauge it based, like you said, based on a schedule. But if you were to try to put a number to it, you know, is there oftentimes as much as 5% variation, 10% variation between underfeeding and overfeeding on certain times or seasons, or is it much smaller number than that? You know, no, how much overfeeding or underfeeding makes a difference, whether it's in biomass or water quality, if you had to try to attach a number to it?
Yeah, well, this is of course the difference between the biologists and engineers. Engineers wants number. So the number, of course, it really depends. For example, in my training, what I have been been trained on is like this. Like when you overfeed, you feed like 10% extra so that the fish is like well fed. You don't take risk in underfeeding, because the problem is that if you underfeed them too much for longer period of time, they start to eat each other, like they are cannibalic, you know. Yeah. So of course it's but I would say the best way in 21st century, providing all the technologies, the best way is to have no extra feeding. Yeah. Have to be precise. And I think if you have like 3 to 5% extra, then of course you have the biofilters, you have mechanical filters, you have the system to take care of it. but of course, the more it is, the more problematic it is to handle.
Right. And how quickly those filters get overwhelmed, right? I mean, again, if you find that balance right, and it's, 3, 5, 10%, whatever it might be, I'm sure somebody smarter out there has probably done some calculations on feed saving cost, filter replacement, filter cleanings, and how that affects the overall process. And, obviously there's some risk again of reducing water quality, overloading a filter, reducing disinfection, and the potential risk for disease spreading in an operation, as a result of that. So there is this delicate balance where I know that risk piece is often hard to quantify. And I think there's always just this kind of general mentality of, well, maybe it's an industry standard to overfeed to some degree, as you mentioned, and to also assume it'll never happen to me. It won't happen to my operation. I know it. I feel like I know it well. But sometimes, the data doesn't lie, and overfeeding can be a real problem on the water quality.
Yeah, of course. You said it quite concise and right. So there is no magic pill in this thing, actually.
Yeah.
But as also one of the point are, as we also mentioned in the last discussion, that people are really important in this whole aspect. For example, if you are not observant enough, if you are not really observing how the things are going, and you are also not monitoring properly, or you are kind of not really punctual, so it of course it affects. And these things just does not happen like overnight. So it's when the news comes in the media that this much amount of fish has died and what happened there or there. So it's not like something just happened in 1 hour or half an hour. So it builds up. It's a process which actually happens. And of course, that's where this quality measurements systems are so important. And they do play a role, of course. But of course, the diligence of the people, that's also a big factor.
Yeah. It is interesting as maybe more of an outsider to some extent, to some extent, having a little bit more experience in some other aspects of the food and beverage side of things. It is interesting to me to see so much just manual observation being such a important and kind of a critical part of the operation, instead of more of a reliance on data and analytics. In such an important business like this that can have such a huge effect on the bottom line for that entire operation, to see a lot of it still relied oftentimes on, I don't want to say gut or instinct, but on, organoleptic, sensory, to see if you have a good feel of overfeeding or not, or if the water changes a little bit of color. I would think it would be, pretty important to catch that as early as possible, which is often tends to be done a lot better with online instruments or more frequent grab samples, perhaps. So
yeah,
interesting.
It's very interesting. And this you use this organoleptic, the word actually. I think this is also when it comes to the fish. If fish don't like the taste of the feed, for example, I would say. So if the taste is not good, then if they leave the feed, for example, sometimes if the feed is too moldy, for example, that's kind of another factor. For example, if the feed is not really right, and it's oxidation process has happened, and the feed has become spoiled, it's too old. So this could affect also the taste, and then when it affects the taste, then they wouldn't really eat it, and this will go to the bottom and then further on destroy the whole thing. So
it's just interesting again to think the importance of operator to operator when you're so reliant on that portion of the process and how different it is. Just an example. I mean, I'm the type of guy, if I have a block of cheese, I don't wait for it to turn pink and slimy and moldy before I toss it out. I gotta wait. I do look at the expiration dates and take action accordingly, where other people probably say, well, I can cut a little bit of this off and I can still kind of eat around this, and everybody's a little bit different where you're making these kind of judgment calls or judgment decisions, oftentimes based on preference, still with the best interest of yourself in mind, just like within the operation, within a RAS facility. Perhaps it's a similar way. Each operator is going to make some of their own judgment calls and own decisions, trying to do what's best. But it's just interesting to not see as much data-driven analysis, perhaps, driving some of those important decisions. But it's interesting. Just a comment.
Yeah, but of course, data is very important. But the fish itself is very unpredictable. So one of the fear I normally have, that despite there are new systems coming in, fish is still is not predictable too much. I mean, fish is really, and it's no one solution for every fish species. So this is also very interesting. Of course, you can have the models get matured with more data if people are using machine learning. So, but still, at the end of the day, it's no one fit for all. So it's still observation is important still. You cannot just kind of afford people not paying attention to the details, and it's very important. And unfortunately, it's a big problem, the human aspect.
Yeah, and I can see in the future as the industry evolved. I mean, I think a heavier reliance on data, probably makes sense as kind of technologies and instrumentation become a little bit easier to integrate, lower cost, easier to implement. But then eventually moving into more predictive analytics as well, because as you said, it's good to have the data, but you need to know what to do with it. You need to know how to interpret it. And like you said, it's not a perfect science, so to speak. You can get some clues on what may be happening. But yeah, being able to have that additional aspect for some level of intelligence, I think would make a lot of sense too. But I know things are quite a ways away from that, unfortunately. But, so, okay. Just for my own curiosity, we've only got a couple minutes left here. I know we want to try to wrap up on a similar time last time. But when you think about different species, and we talk about, I don't want to say just that finickiness or difference between different species, are there ones from your experience that you feel at least the feeding aspect tends to be more consistent and reliable for certain species and less so for others? Could you identify which ones those may be, just out of curiosity and people's interest?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's some of the fish which grow faster. I mean, this is not to endorse certain species. I don't want to make people angry if they're working in salmon, and I don't want to make people angry if they're working with tilapia. So that's my problem. So, but just to, in my observation, if you have tilapias, for example, they are quite fast eater. They don't have too much leftover, as to say. So their FCR could be also quite good, and they grow faster, of course. So this is also how much feed you offer. So some of the species which grow slowly, that's a salmon, trout, in that aspect, difference with tilapia. So these species which grow slowly, of course, you also give them offer less feed based on their quota, the daily rations. But whereas on the other hand, tilapia, they eat more. Of course, they grow faster. So that you can imagine that how these dynamics play out. And also one of the interesting factor which you triggered while discussing is this, that you have to also understand that if you have a fish species with the life cycle from the whole grow out is just 3 to 4 months, let's say, I'm just saying tilapia or any other similar species. So then you also, after 3 to 4 months, your system is free, right? For 1 month or 15 days, your system will have a rest.
Right.
You wouldn't have that buildup of the leftover feed particles or the feces, and this type of like the other aspects which are important. Whereas if you have a grow out system with a species like salmon or trout, which you know that this fish, if there is a certain period, of course, it's like even the grow out can have a different cycle. For example, if you have to move them to the next level, but let's suppose that one of the cycle where they have to stay too long, let's say. So in that cycle, there will be big issues, of course. I mean, this is the common sense. So these are important factors which should be considered. But then again, I wouldn't endorse one species over the other. But of course, I would say if one is more local species, so it doesn't make any sense to do salmon production in Africa, for example. Mm-hmm. It makes a lot of sense to do tilapia production in Africa. So I mean, this time it's some of the things, I mean, get triggered by that local 5 concept I had. Sure. So it's like also you have to care about the cost of doing things. For example, if you have to, if you're doing a warm water species in a cold country, for example, with the cold water, and you have to heat the water up, it doesn't make sense, right?
Right.
And vice versa, for example. So these are some of the factors I would say are also important to, or more elaboration on your question.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And then too, to think about that longer period for certain species, how that affects the water quality, and as you said, the system in general. It's interesting to kind of think about that aspect as well. So, and maybe we should talk about that next time. I know we're kind of wrapping up where we had hoped to get to time-wise, at least. As usual, always want to get into a little bit more with you than we did in the time, but hey, just give us an excuse to maybe do it again. So
yeah, let's do it. I mean, let's discuss more aspects next time and try to cover more topics.
Yeah, that sounds good. Maybe we'll touch into some of the water quality pieces next time, pick up where we left off here, see what feedback we get from others. And yeah, we'll wrap it up for today. So, hey, thanks again, Sonny. And look forward to doing it again soon.
Thank you, Brian. Bye-bye.
All right, thank you.